This is Intercepted.
Welcome to Dropsite News. I'm Murtaza Hussain. The Trump administration's crackdown on free speech related to Israel-Palestine escalated dramatically this month, with the arrest and possible deportation of Columbia University student organizer Mahmoud Khalil. This week, as Dropsite reported, a second individual, a postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown University named Badr Khan Suri, was also arrested by masked Department of Homeland Security agents outside his home, and now faces the prospect of deportation as well. More arrests have been promised by administration officials, sending a chilling message to others who choose to speak out about the ongoing assault on Gaza. After years of complaints by conservatives about campus-safe spaces and so-called repressive tolerance, the Trump administration is now using brute legal measures and accusations of discrimination on campus to silence free speech entirely. Making the matter more dystopian, the subject being shut down, the nature of the U.S. security relationship with Israel, is one that is critical to U.S. foreign policy. To discuss this matter, we are now joined by Jenin Younes. Janine is a civil liberties attorney and an expert in First Amendment issues. Janine, welcome to Dropsite.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So, Janine, since October 7th, we've been covering and monitoring a very broad range of civil liberties crackdowns in the United States, targeting people on campuses, in workplaces, people being fired or otherwise politically repressed for speech that they've made on this subject. You're a civil liberties expert and a First Amendment expert. You've been working on these issues for many, many years prior to the current conflict. Can you talk a bit about what you've seen personally in terms of the climate for free speech in the United States related to this topic?
Yeah, well, it's obviously been quite, escalating since October 7th. It's a bit unprecedented, I would say, starting around October 7th. But what's happened recently is really new, I would say, in terms of the gravity of what the Trump administration is doing. So a lot of what happened under Biden, I don't think, was so much coordinated governmental assaults on free speech, although there was some of that coming from Congress. These congressional hearings where they were dragging in the administration presidents of many universities and basically threatening them and saying if they didn't do more to crack down on pro-Palestine speech, there would be consequences. That was sort of an informal censorship regime. Trump has really escalated it to a formal censorship regime where people are being deported, universities are having funds withdrawn if they don't stifle pro-Palestine speech. What I will say is this is actually a longer-term issue than it might appear. One reason I actually got interested in free speech issues as a much younger attorney was my father. I grew up with a Palestinian father, and he talked a lot about how you simply cannot talk about this issue or you're going to lose your job. So I was very cognizant of the cancel culture around this issue and the fact that when you stifle certain viewpoints, it really means that Americans don't have the full picture and they can't understand the complexities of the political situation. And so that was one of the things that led me to become a free speech lawyer.
Yeah, it's a great point. I have kind of, in some sense, very strong civil libertarian leanings for this reason as well, too, because, post 9/11, you saw the very stringent crackdowns on speech and association and things like that. And it really underlines the importance, Janine, what you said, that people should be able to know and debate these things so they can make informed decisions. And it seems to me that there's always been an exception somehow for the Palestine issue, specifically in the United States. As you mentioned, that didn't start in October 7th. What was the climate prior? And you mentioned even your father told you many, many years ago that this is an issue not to be discussed openly. What were some of the reasons for that, and what was the legal and social political infrastructure in place that made people feel that pressure?
I don't think there was so much organized legal censorship around it. It was much more of an informal cancel culture where, if you're in certain professions, you just can't talk about that issue. Students who talk about this issue knew that they'd have certain career paths closed to them. And you have people like Norman Finkelstein, who was denied tenure. I'm sure most people have heard of him, or Steven Saleta, who were very pro-Palestine, and there were organized efforts to make sure they didn't get their tenured professorships, even though they were completely qualified. And it was very clear that what had happened was the Zionist lobby had taken immense efforts to undermine them so they couldn't get those positions. And my dad, I don't want to throw any shade on him at all. He meant very well. I don't blame him at all, but he just sort of raised us like, I'm going to tell you these stories, but don't talk to people about this issue because otherwise you're not going to be able to have a good job. And so that was just very ingrained in me, the fact that you simply cannot talk about this issue, especially just in certain circles. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because I was actually a public defender prior to becoming a free speech attorney in New York, and you could. At my job there, it was completely open. There was a very large pro-Palestine contingent. It didn't have that kind of cancel culture around it. But in most, I would say, if you want to pursue most careers, a lot of paths will be closed to you. And that's just been the case for decades.
You mentioned something very interesting with there's like a public-private partnership in censorship in this case. And I think that in other subjects as well, too, you've seen this sort of censorship regime exist in the United States, which uses private companies, telecommunications, social media companies to act as partners with the government in censoring certain views. And it's funny because in the United States, we tend to pride ourselves, part of our identity, that we have a very expansive free speech protections and ability to speak freely on subjects that people in other countries, in many cases, don't. But there is this insidious, sort of informal, quasi-legal censorship regime which works with private companies and the government. Can you talk a bit about how that manifests in practice? And then, in addition to that, what specifically we've been seeing in terms of Palestinian speech since October 7th in this nexus?
Yeah, so actually, I brought a case to the Supreme Court last year involving exactly this issue, and I was defending conservative speech, like what's traditionally considered conservative. My clients were people who had questioned lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine mandates. They are not actually all conservative leaning, but this was sort of speech that steamed on the conservative edge. Another of the plaintiffs, who I didn't represent, runs the Gateway Pundit, which is a very right-wing website, and he said that he had been censored for posting the Hunter Biden laptop story and doubting that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. And the argument there was that this material had been censored by social media companies, but it was at the government's behest, and the government had exerted different kinds of influence, encouragement, coercion, pressure, threats, in order to get the companies to censor the speech viewpoints that it didn't like. And that's prohibited under the First Amendment. And there's a pretty robust body of case law that says the government can't use third parties to do what it can't do directly under the Constitution. So the government can't, for instance, if they don't have probable cause to believe you've committed a crime and they haven't gotten a warrant, they can't get a private company to go search your home instead of them. And likewise, we sort of made an analogous argument that they can't instrumentalize these private companies in order to accomplish their censorship aims. I'm actually not a conservative, but I very much believe in free speech. And I warned a lot of liberals who were celebrating the Supreme Court's decision that was adverse to us and who were proponents of what the government was doing, that this will one day be used against you. And that happened far sooner than I ever could have imagined, because after October 7th, there were a number of incidents I heard of where pro-Palestine speech was cracked down on social media. Now, this was complicated by the fact that once Elon Musk took over, and I want to be clear, I have like many, many, many criticisms of Elon Musk. I'm not a fangirl, but he did end a lot of the censorship. I don't get censored the same way that I used to. My friends don't. I haven't observed the same kind of viewpoint discriminatory censorship. So things, I think, got a little bit better. But I think that pro-Palestine accounts are deboosted. And on Facebook and Instagram, I think their content moderation is much more pro-Israel. So I know that a lot of that speech gets censored, and probably there's some involvement with governmental involvement.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned you did caveat that you're not conservative when you mentioned you're in favor of free speech. It's strange that free speech has become coded as a conservative sort of value in the United States. It's really it's a protection which envelops everyone regardless of their ideological background. So defending it in an indiscriminate manner, in an impartial manner, is so important, as you're pointing out to. So I want to ask you also too that you mentioned that under the Trump administration we've seen to a greater degree than before a expansion of the legal censorship in different means of specifically pro-Palestinian speech. At Dropside last year, we did a story about something called the Esther Project, which is a a program of the Heritage Foundation that they described as a means of, effectively of crushing the pro-Palestinian protest movement, which was then taking place in the United States on campuses. And they mentioned a number of things. They mentioned specifically this public-private partnership that you alluded to. They mentioned kind of high level, vaguely. But they also said the use of, immigration powers, counterterrorism powers, many other things. Also blacklisting of individuals as well, too, as a means of having a very supercharged cancel culture, you could say. Can you talk a bit about what's been happening under Trump and what sort of legal measures that we're seeing come into place right now?
So, as you aptly described, it's really a multifaceted effort to shut down pro-Palestine speech, and it's clear that they're kind of just using any legal avenue they can think of. So there's the deportation angle, and I think most people are paying attention to the Mahmoud Khalil case. He's here on a green card. He was put in ICE detention for sort of nebulously described pro-Palestine activity. It became very clear within a couple of days that there was no allegation that he had committed any crimes, but that he was just being punished for his pro-Palestine speech. The law on this is complicated. Briefly put, I would say it's not settled, but the First Amendment and textual originalists should embrace this. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It's a restraint on government. It's not about the immigration status of the speaker. So I think people who are being honest about the framers' intent and what the texts say will not advocate for people being deported based purely on their speech, their ideas, or their participation in protests. Unfortunately, a lot of conservatives have proved to be very unprincipled and have sort of just taken advantage of the political moment. Another facet or another means through which they're doing this is defunding universities that don't stifle down on pro-Palestine speech and activism to their desire. And there's, Colombia is punishing a woman for writing a pro-Palestine op-ed. I heard that a class at UCLA on the health situation in Gaza has been canceled because they're responding to Trump's threats. And he's making good on those threats. He just withdrew $400 million in funds from Colombia. The Supreme Court's been very clear that the government cannot condition funding once it's doing that on suppression of certain viewpoints. So if the government decides to fund programs, it can't then say, we're only going to fund these programs if you suppress certain ideas, certain viewpoints. So the case law is against the administration there. And then I'm not exactly sure what the landscape looks like for the speech of non-citizens and people who don't work on campuses, but they've made some allusions to using terrorism laws to come after American citizens for pro-Palestine speech, which is obviously very scary. And given that terrorism is defined now as pro-Palestine advocacy, that means, if they successfully redefine those terms that way and they get friendly judges, this, is very scary. And all they have to do, they don't have to win in the Supreme Court at the end of the day. All they have to do is successfully make one person sit in prison for a few months in pretrial detention. And then that chills everybody else. Like everybody else is like, well, I can't take that risk. I can't take that risk. I have a 14-month-old. I'm not going to do anything that's going to risk me spending any time in prison or jail. So these are the ways in which they're trying to tamp down on speech. And it's extremely, extremely frightening.
Earlier this year, just before the Mahmoud Khalil case became public, in fact, we did a story about Columbia University. And obviously, they're under a lot of pressure from the Trump administration over these protests and allegations of anti-Semitism and so forth. And I was reporting the story, and it was very interesting because Columbia had effectively, and still exists, they created a specific office called the Office of Institutional Equity, which in theory was there to uphold impartial diversity and equity standards around the school and issue disciplinary measures against people, faculty or students who would transgress those measures. But in practice, it seemed like just to be about Palestine speech on campus. And so I spoke to a number of students who were affected by it, and they described to me that, they were being brought in for these panels, and they were, you can only join the panel and see the evidence against you if you sign an NDA. So it was a very authoritarian sort of environment. And specifically, they were using the allegation that the speech had made certain people on campus feel unsafe and impugn their safety. There was no allegations of violence per se, but that the speech had made them feel unsafe. And so I was, reading this, and it was very dystopian, and it was very strange the way that they described all of it. But it reminded me of some things that conservatives have been saying in the opposite. A couple of years ago, they were saying, chastising, very loudly and sometimes very with great fervor and eloquence, the use of safetyism as a means of suppressing speech. But now it seems like the same arguments are being employed against pro-Palestinian speech without any sense of irony about the fact that they've been opposing this very recently. Can you talk a bit about just what you've observed in this regard? Because you're someone who's been sort of consistent and principled about your approach to the subject throughout. How has this sort of been a hypocrisy which has been laid bare by the subject?
I mean, the hypocrisy is almost indescribable. The levels of hypocrisy. It's hard for me to even understand how people can do it with a straight face. It's exactly the same kind of language, the exact same kind of justifications that conservatives have ridiculed, have tried to get rid of, DEI programs, the idea of safe spaces, the idea that speech is violence. And I agreed with conservatives on these things. I agreed that we shouldn't have hate speech laws because as much as I might detest some of the speech that is allowed, if we allow hate speech, which I think is tolerated under the First Amendment, I think it's much more dangerous to have government policing our speech. And now they're using exactly the same kinds of justifications. What they do is they say anti-Semitism and they say terrorist speech. And that gets everybody to stop asking questions. And it worked on me to an extent, so I kind of know how this works. I didn't even want the allegation of anti-Semitism, so I didn't speak up. And, now that I have spoken up, saying things like Israel should not continue to drop bombs on Gaza, you get accused of anti-Semitism. How is that anti-Semitic? It's utterly ridiculous. And the idea that we can't even have discussions about this. I engaged in a social media dialogue with somebody. I don't know if you remember, about a year ago, a woman on one of the California campuses was prevented from, she was supposed to give the valedictorian speech at graduation, and she had apparently posted "from the river to the sea." And this was someone who had purported to be super pro-civil liberties and pro-free speech during COVID. And he was arguing with me that it was an implicit call for genocide. And I said, no, it's not. You can't make that assumption. It's a phrase that's, ambiguous at best. I doubt most people mean it that way. And then he sent me her Instagram page saying "from the river to the sea." And she had explicitly said, my call from the river, when I say "from the river to the sea," I mean, I want Palestinians and Jews to live side by side in peace. And I highlighted it for him. And he still wouldn't concede. He's, he dealt that's a fantasy idea. And I said, so you're saying college students can't say things that are a fantasy idea, which I don't even necessarily think it is. But this complete irrationality, the complete hypocrisy, the complete abandonment of every principle, there are no words to describe it. And I've seen it from people I know personally. This isn't like random people on social media, countless people I know personally. And it's shocking.
Yeah, that's very well put. I've been shocked to see it too, because it was not that long ago that they were making these arguments in their favor. It was literally within, a very recent memory, like just before, I think right up to October 7th, they were making these arguments and they just immediately switched them thereafter. It's been very, very jarring. Janine, also this issue is something which the U.S. is very involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's not that it's just a foreign conflict that people have different opinions about. Our taxpayer money, the attention of our elected officials, a lot of our government is devoted to taking part in this conflict in a very partisan manner. On one side, we are implicated in what international courts have deemed likely human rights abuses as a result of our involvement in this conflict. It's really important for us to be able to discuss it. If you could have a different opinion about it, that's fine. But the idea that this extremely vital aspect of American foreign policy is off limits to discussions by the citizens of the country, it strikes me as very totalitarian in a way. And, totalitarian systems and authoritarian systems are not always rolled out uniformly across all subjects and across the entire population at once. Oftentimes they start with, a certain subsect of the population or a certain issue that is divisive or polarizing or so forth. And then once the rules established, then it can be broadened out thereafter. So, Janine, what are some of the legal and administrative precedents which are being set right now to suppress pro-Palestinian speech, which you think could be expanded to other segments of the population in the future if they do become precedents?
Well, I think Khalil's case, for instance, is very important. If he loses, and he very well might, I'm very nervous, that's going to set a really bad precedent for free speech because it'll allow the government to use national security justifications to punish anybody whose speech departs from the government's foreign policy. And that's what they've said, that his speech conflicts with their foreign policy. I don't know that I've ever been aware of a situation where the government has used that as a justification or pretext, I'd say in this case, for deporting somebody. There were some cases during the communist era, but it was a little bit different because those people had actually belonged to the Communist Party at some point. And in the United States, it was also illegal to belong to the Communist Party. I think there are still First Amendment issues there, but it was a little bit different. Here they're talking just about the viewpoint he espoused. And also, this isn't about overthrowing the United States government. That was more the fear with the communist issues. This is about protecting a foreign country. So I don't agree with the outcome of those cases, but even under those, I think can be differentiated. So if they expand it in this way, I think that's very dangerous. If the courts say that if the courts sort of buy this anti-Semitism notion, I don't know how much you want me to get into the legal ins and outs, but the theory is that under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, universities have a duty to protect students from discrimination based on race, national origin, religion, etc. So what these students, there were lawsuits filed on this basis. So the students argued that the universities were failing to protect them from anti-Semitic discrimination, and they did that by conflating Zionism with anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism by saying that Zionism was core to their identity, and so if you argued against Israel's actions or you argued against the notion of an exclusive Jewish state, you were effectively discriminating against them in violation of Title VI. And the government has utilized those same concepts to go after the universities. They're using Title VI, which is just really preposterous when you think about it. Like when you think about the purpose of Title VI, it's ridiculous. But courts are unpredictable, and judges are humans, and lots of them watch Fox News. And so, a lot of them have preconceived notions. A lot of them really think that these campuses are rife with anti-Semitic violence, basically the Ku Klux Klan, which is obviously not what's happening. I'm not saying everything has been perfectly peaceful, but I think it's more been sort of what you would expect between 18-year-olds who have very different opinions on things and might have gotten a little bit passionate at times on both sides. But they're, these sort of, the picture they're painting of like these pogroms taking place against Jewish students is absurd, but half this country thinks that's happening. And that's a big part of the problem. The students in a couple of these Title VI cases have won, which makes me very, very nervous. And that's just going to set a very bad precedent. In terms of clamping down on pro-Palestine speech, but also could be used, expanded to other contexts in the future.
Yeah, that's what I found too when I was investigating the Columbia University Office of Equity. They were using Title VI, which I always thought is something which was more about, preventing African-American kids from being banned from school and things like that, like the civil rights era struggles that associated with. Now it's being used to deem Israel a discriminated party in the United States, and support for Israel as something which is somehow needs legal protection against discrimination. It struck me as very bizarre as a non-legal expert.
It's extremely bizarre, but you and I are ensconced in this world, right? So to me, I hear these arguments and I'm like, that's patently absurd. But most judges, they don't know that much about this issue. So they hear anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and they're like, oh, okay. And these are smart people, but they're not people who know a ton about Middle East politics. They're not people who've heard about this issue their entire lives and who really see how those concepts are conflated. I mean, to me, it's very clear that disagreeing with somebody about a political philosophy, which is what Zionism is a totally different thing than discriminating against them based on their national origin, their race, their religion, or their gender. Well, that's Title IX, not Title VI. But I have suggested to some lawyers that this theory could actually be turned on its head. I mean, I don't know if I like the idea of kind of using it because I don't agree that it should be used this way, but I kind of want to be like, well, if they're going to do it, we can do it too. why, as a Palestinian, don't Palestinian students have the right to say their struggle for their homeland is part of their identity? And why should their speech be suppressed? That, it's effectively Title VI discrimination if they're prevented from advocating for their people and for their homeland. So that could be a clever legal argument someone could make at some point.
Yeah, it does seem like this is opening a Pandora's box, which in the end would be detrimental to the First Amendment, which would have negative consequences for all Americans. Because in a lot of these cases, too, they don't necessarily say that discrimination against Israel per se is the reason that they're pursuing these cases. They say that, well, you can't discriminate against people who have a country that has a majority religious character or something like that, something which is able to describe Israel effectively but not explicitly. And then, by that extension, you can say, well, you can't discriminate against Iran or Pakistan or these countries that also have religious characters in the national state. But then were people to pursue that by the logical extension, then you would see gradually deterioration of free speech rights in the United States, and the First Amendment would be hollowed out entirely, which I think, unfortunately, these measures are sort of opening the door to. So, Janine, if these legal measures do become, solid precedents that you can't discriminate against a certain country or, against a country with a majority religious category, which could pertain to other countries besides Israel as well, like Iran or Pakistan, that also have religious characters, what would the broader implications be for the First Amendment in the United States? And I ask that question because a lot of people listening to this podcast or following the subject at a distance, they may see it as something which is sort of arcane or very segmented sort of legal or political fight. But I really do believe that this does have a broader implication for the Constitution more broadly. And I'm curious your own take of that, looking at this issue up close.
Yeah, that's very apt. Anytime that we allow the government to start chipping away at free speech in one area, it can come back to haunt you. I talked to liberals during the Biden era about this issue of the Biden administration being involved in social media censorship. And they were like, but we need people to get vaccinated. We can't have misinformation about the vaccine. And I was like, misinformation is protected speech. The government cannot, the whole point of the First Amendment is that open discourse and dialogue is the way that we reach the truth, not by censorship. And sooner than they even realized it, they're sort of facing these same justifications being used against them. A lot of people, unfortunately, still don't see it. They think like, well, that's bad speech. And what I was saying was good speech. So it's, but the broader point is once you allow the government this power, it can be your speech next. And this is not how we reach good ideas, is not by allowing government to punish us, to deport or imprison us or fine us for our ideas. We talk about them. And I think Glenn Greenwald puts this very well. I don't want to not give him credit, but nobody thinks their own ideas should be censored. There's no one who thinks my ideas should be censored. The whole point of free speech is to fight for the ideas that you don't necessarily agree with, and against government being able to restrict them. And another justification for the First Amendment is that censorship doesn't really work. It just drives ideas underground. It actually creates more extremism. I think that's actually very true. And during COVID, what happened was people who were kicked off Twitter would go to Gab and Getter and Parler, which were just right-wing sort of echo chambers. And so when someone tweeted, well, the vaccine has a microchip, instead of having 25 people jump on them and say, no, it doesn't, they had a lot of people saying, yes, yeah, and the 5G technology too. So that's sort of the philosophy that the framers operated under when they included the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. And we all have to come together and defend free speech for everybody, not just ourselves, or it's going to be gone.
Yeah, you put that very well, Janine. And I will give an analogy too. I was in Syria recently. We've been covering Syria a lot at Drop Site, and there was no free speech in Syria under the previous government. And one thing I realized is that free speech and the ability to talk about these issues, it's like a steam valve for society. Because if you are able to talk about things and have a discourse about them, but even vent some of your sentiments, especially about very emotional topics like war and things like this that do come about from time to time, it allows people to sort through their conflicts in a nonviolent way. But when you suppress all the discussion and you just say you can't talk about it and you'll be in trouble if you do, and you have this very authoritarian regime and power of censorship and so forth to suppress discussion, what happens is the pressure just keeps building up. It builds up and builds up, and then one day, it blows up. And in Syria, that happened. People weren't able to speak for many, many years, and then from an outsider's perspective, it seemed like everything was fine. And then one day, you just saw all this pent-up anger and the things people were whispering eventually became, part of the public discourse in a very, very uncontrolled manner. That's why I think that protecting free speech on this issue and other issues is just so, so vital for the stability of the United States in the long term. And it's very worrisome to see that what's happening right now with these very poorly thought out, in my opinion, measures of developing the censorship regime in a place where the First Amendment is such a core part of identity. So, Jeanine, this is my last question I want to ask you, and we kind of touched on it a little bit, but it's just something which is so irksome to myself and many others, and I think to you as well. This sort of 180 that we've seen among so many people about free speech. And I won't say specific names, but I'm just kind of interested in your perspective on it because, I continue to hold to the belief that I would defend people's speech even if they're different from mine and that the principle is important and so forth. But I think it's been revealed that it's a pretty small bubble of people who believe that. And I think you're part of the bubble, and Glenn Greenwald, you mentioned, is probably part of the bubble, but there's not that many people who seem to hold to this. What would you say just in terms of how do we build sort of understanding and a robust sort of movement in defense of free speech? And I'm kind of curious, amid all the gloom, what have you seen in some of the green shoots and good examples of people defending speech at a time when it's so threatened in the United States?
Okay, yeah, I'll take that. So I was actually going to start with a bad example. I'll do that anyway. So pessimistic. As an example of how hypocritical people can be, there's someone who I won't name who was fired for sort of racist speech at his job. And I know him. And when I started saying what I was saying about Palestine, he was advocating for me to get fired. So he went on the cancel tour when he got fired, and all of that. And I have never in my life demanded that somebody get fired, demanded that they get deported, no matter how much I abhor their speech. And you just have to have a tolerance. You have to just... Your instinct when you hear something you don't like, and maybe it's not our nature, maybe you have to train yourself a little. It's not like I want to get rid of this person or, you don't have to be best friends, but the idea that you should exert whatever power you have in order to silence them, and if you can get the government to do it even better, I think we have to resist that temptation because for the reasons I explained, that can very, very quickly be turned against you. And free expression and free speech are really what I think makes America special. I have some trouble saying America's great right now, but to the extent we have something that makes us, gives us a promise that maybe some other countries don't have, even in Europe, is that we have this First Amendment that doesn't allow the government to censor us based on the viewpoints we've expressed. So we have that. I think we need a renewed commitment to this. And I have seen a lot, I will say with the Khalil case, I've seen a lot of people rise to the occasion, even people who are extremely on the other side of the Israel-Palestine issue. Eli Lake, I'll give a shout out to him. I disagree with him on everything related to Israel-Palestine, but he did say Khalil shouldn't be deported. A few other people who even are very, very pro-Israel. So I think there is some understanding that this is not the way to go. And I think people need to think through the implications of allowing the government to punish people for their speech.
Absolutely, Janine. That's very well said. Janine Younes, thank you so much for joining us on Dropsite today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Janine Younes, a civil liberties attorney and expert in First Amendment issues. And that does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our new podcast feed by searching for Dropsite News wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please do leave us a rating or review. It helps other listeners to find us as well. Our show today was produced by Jose Oliveras. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe to dropsitenews.com. If you have the funds to do so, please become a paid subscriber. All of our content is free for anyone, but our paid subscribers are the fuel that keeps our engine running. Make sure to follow us on all social media platforms, and please do share our work. This program was made possible, in part, by a grant from The Intercept. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Murtaza Hussain.